In this tutorial, we're going to dip our toe into the vast ocean that is Adobe Illustrator. Now, Adobe Illustrator is a really powerful tool for generating vector-based graphics. If you're familiar with Photoshop, the layout's going to look pretty similar, and things like the Layers panel are going to function in much the same way. One of the big differences between these two softwares, though, is the job that they have to do. Photoshop is really great for working with pixel-based art. And to give you an example of what that means, let me open up Photoshop. So I've got this image in Photoshop here, right? Let's take a look at this shape down here in this corner. The more I zoom, the more pixelated and blurry it gets. If I open up Illustrator and I redraw that same shape in that software, you'll notice that I can zoom in forever and it will never get blurry. It's also smart, which means that I can take this shape and I can edit it after the fact. This is what a vector-based drawing is. If you remember anything from algebra, you can think of it this way. A pixel-based or raster image is a lot like when you take a formula, you plug in a few values, you get some points, and you plot them. This is like the graph of the points that you've plotted. What's there is there, and you can't really add any more information between them unless you know what the formula is. In this case, we just have the dots, and we don't know the formula. Illustrator, on the other hand, knows the formula. So if you can imagine that same graph, if we were to zoom in, the dots that would just get further apart in the pixel-based image can be filled in with more dots because Illustrator knows the formula. Now, if you've forgotten or repressed all that stuff about math and algebra, then don't worry about it. The important thing that you need to know is that Illustrator will help you create better, smarter, and more scalable images. So let's start at the beginning. Let's see how we can use some of the tools in Illustrator to make a simple diagram, like the one we just saw. So I'm going to bail on this one, and I don't need to save it. Okay, so here we are at the Illustrator start screen. We're going to say Create New. Now in Photoshop, it would be really important to get all this stuff right from the very beginning, because if we started making an image that was too small, it would be a real pain to try to make it bigger. In Illustrator, it's not nearly as big of a deal, because everything in Illustrator is smart, and it's way easier to scale. Now since I'm just making a simple diagram, I'm just going to use this mobile 10" by 10" template. This takes us to this screen. If your screen doesn't look like this, if you've got some different menus and stuff over here, you should know that I'm using the Essentials workspace. This thing right here, this is our artboard. This is our pasteboard. We're going to be working in this area. If we need to resize our artboard, we can open our artboard window and click this thing. We can change the settings here. One way to think about Illustrator, which is an oversimplification, but I think an effective one, is that it likes to work in strokes and fills. If you've ever drawn a shape in a Microsoft Office or a Google Docs document, then you're probably already familiar with this concept. To illustrate this point, I'm going to go over here, open my menu of primitives, choose the rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle. With the black arrow selected, I can change the stroke and the fill of this selected object. In this case, my fill is white, my stroke is black. To change it, double-click on one of these squares. The solid square is the fill, and the hollow square is the stroke. If I want to change the fill of this rectangle to red, I can do it here. If I want to change the stroke, I'll double-click on this guy. Maybe I want to change it to this blue. If I want to make it thicker, I can go up here and change it to some other value. These basic shapes, called primitives in Illustrator, often have some cool built-in features. For example, if, with the black arrow, I click on this thing, it will activate the shape, give me the grips that I can use to resize it. If I hold down Shift, it'll constrain the proportions, and it will also show me these little dots in the corners. I can click on them to round the corners. I can double-click on them and be way more specific. So if I want to make these corners a specific radius, I can enter that here. If I want to unlink them and make just one corner a specific radius, I can do that here. Now obviously I'm not limited to just basic shapes in Illustrator, although I can use basic shapes to create more complex shapes by combining them. For example, with the black arrow selected, I can click on this guy, say copy, paste, then select both of these guys, and I come over here to what's called the Shapebuilder tool and say this is a thing, and this is a thing. Then I could delete this, or undo this, and delete this, or undo this, and delete that. Or if I undo all this stuff, I could select all these things, go up to Window, and open what are called my Pathfinder commands, and then I can combine them into one shape. Or if I undo that, maybe I want to remove the front shape from the back shape. Or if I undo that, maybe I want to just keep the overlap. Or I want to just remove the overlap. There are all sorts of things that I can do with these tools to create more complex shapes out of simple shapes. But believe it or not, I think that's often the harder way to do something in Illustrator. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the pen tool, the curvature tool, the pencil tool, and the blob brush tool as ways of creating simple and effective diagrams quickly in Illustrator. Okay, so let's get rid of this stuff by selecting it and hitting delete, and let's take a look at a few of those tools. First things first, let's start with the pencil tool. That's this guy right here. If you don't see it, hold this down, and you'll find it in this group with the paintbrush, the blob brush, and the smooth tool. Yours may or may not have a path eraser tool, but we can add that later. If you've ever used Microsoft Paint before, you probably remember the pencil tool as the thing that made not very nice looking stuff. If I draw a heart with it, it looks a lot like a heart we'd get out of Microsoft Paint, especially because I'm drawing it with a mouse. The path's jerky and it kind of stinks, so let's delete it. The cool thing about the pencil tool though is that you can tweak it so that the stuff that you draw with it looks a lot better. If I go over to the pencil tool and I double click on it, on this fidelity slider, I can move it from accurate to smooth. Now let's try it again. Even though I drew it crooked, the paths look a lot better. So if I'm a little bit more careful, I can get something that looks pretty decent. What I can also do is bump the stroke up a little bit. That's nice and smooth. Now, you can see here, if I zoom in, which I can do by holding my Alt or Option key on the scroll wheel, or using the pinch gesture on a touchpad, I've got this little thing down here that I want to clean up. To do this, let's use the white arrow. The white arrow will let me click on a path and select an anchor point. Anchor points are what define the location and the direction of paths. If I zoom out, I can see that I've got a bunch of them on this path. I can simply grab the anchor point and move it. Now, the end of this stroke doesn't look very good the way that it joins up. So what I can do is I can open my stroke window, and I can change the settings of the stroke so that the cap, instead of being flat or a butt cap, is round. Way better. If I click on this path again, I can change the fill to a different color. If I'm drawing with the pencil tool, and I get a rough spot in my path, then what I can do is go back over it with the pencil tool, and Illustrator will redraw it. Or if I undo that, I can try this little tool here, which is the smooth tool, and go back over the path there, and it'll do its best to smooth out any rough spots. Now, when it's this bad, it's not really going to work. In short, the pencil tool draws a line that you can assign a thickness to, adjust, or even fill. Let's wipe this stuff out real quick. And now let's look at the next tool, which is the Blob Brush tool. It lives in the same menu with the pencil tool. Like the pencil tool, I can double click on it, and I can adjust the path smoothing to prioritize accuracy or smoothness. I can also adjust the size, I can adjust the angle, and I can adjust the roundness. To see how this looks, let's draw another heart. That's a pretty bad heart, but the important point is that unlike the pencil tool, which just draws a stroke, this thing draws a filled shape. So if I click on my white arrow key, I can see that this shape has an inside and an outside border, which I can further illustrate by changing the color of that stroke, or both of those strokes, and increasing the thickness. This is great if you want a freehand closed shape. That's how that tool works. All right, so let's get rid of that stuff. Let's do Control-0 or Command-0 to recenter this document in our window. And look at the next tool. That's going to be the Curvature Tool, which is this thing here. The Curvature Tool draws a spline through the points that I click. If I don't want it to be filled, I can select that shape and simply hit this thing, which applies for all the tools and shapes, to simply have this thing be transparent. If I want to change this path, again, I can always adjust the stroke, but I can also adjust the anchor points if I click on the white arrow, drag an anchor point, move it around. I can grab these handles to adjust the direction that the path enters and exits the anchor point, or I can delete the anchor point altogether. If I undo that, and I click on it, I also have the option of converting the anchor point from a smooth anchor point to a sharp one. You can see my dot came back, and just like on the square primitive, I can drag this dot to add some roundness to that corner. Okay, let's get rid of this stuff, and look at our next tool, which is the pen tool. It's a lot like the Curvature Tool, except instead of drawing smooth points, it draws sharp ones. You can use the white arrow tool or the direct selection tool to highlight those anchor points and move them around. You can also convert them from sharp points to smooth points by clicking this button. You can change the direction that they enter the point, just like in the Curvature Tool. If I hold down Option or Alt, I can change just one of them at a time. If I want to add more anchor points, I can click on this guy here, which is the pen with the plus, and add more anchor points to the path. If I want to convert that to a sharp point, I click this button again. I can also cut the path at anchor points by selecting the anchor point and using this tool, Cut Path at Selected Anchor Points. Cut it, move it. I can reconnect them, like so. And of course, I can fill it. Let's use Command-0 or Control-0 to recenter our artwork. Let's get rid of this window here. Get rid of this window here too. All right, let's talk about a couple of other Illustrator basics here. If I click on this shape, this thing right here, this is the bounding box. I can hover over the corner and rotate it. If I don't see my bounding box, go to View, and make sure that the bounding box is on. Mine says Hide Bounding Box because mine's shown. If yours isn't shown, it'll say Show Bounding Box. The other thing that you want is your Smart Guides. Mine's checked, and what that lets me do is when I'm going to go grab, is when I am drawing stuff, it'll highlight things that I can snap to. I can also Control Copy and Paste, which will add another shape in front of the old one. If I need to rearrange these so the new one is behind the old one, let's rotate it here so it's a little more clear. I can simply right-click, go to Arrange, and say Send Backward or Send to Back. Now you can see this one is in front of that one. I can also change the transparency of stuff by adjusting the opacity. And if I want to stay organized, I can add another layer. I can select an object. In this little square over here, this tells me what layer I'm on. I can drag it to another layer. And if I want to, I can turn it off. One more thing that I want to cover, because all the shapes that we've drawn so far have been solid, is how to draw a shape that has a hole in it. We looked at it briefly using the Pathfinder tool, but there's another way to do it that I think is easier to work with. And that is simply to draw another shape, select both of these, right-click, and say Make Compound Path. Now when I select this, it's got a hole in it. But I can still change things and adjust it like I was working with any other shape that had anchor points in it. Change your mind? No problem. Click on this thing, go to Object, go down to Compound Path, and say Release. Now you can grab this guy, move it away, toss it if you want. Alright, now that we've rummaged through our digital toolbox a little bit, let's use some of those to work through part of an example and make a diagram. So I've deleted that thing, and I've still got one hanging out on that other layer, so I'm going to delete that. And let's just go ahead and get us back to one layer as if we were starting from a very fresh, brand new document. Now the easiest way that I think this is going to be is to simply trace over a diagram that I drew by hand. Now of course I could always just freehand it in Illustrator, and the process would basically be the same, but if I've already got a hand sketch, then why not just trace it? And I've got one on a post-it note. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to File, I'm going to say Place, and I'm going to grab that sketch, which for me is right here. I can just drop it somewhere on the artboard, and I'll probably want to resize a little bit. Now, I don't want it to get smushed at all, so I'm going to hold down Shift as I resize it. And I'll probably snap it to the corner about there. And that's going to be good enough for what we're doing right here. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just draw over these shapes that I already drew by hand. To make sure that I accidentally don't click on this thing and move it around during this process, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it on its own layer. So it's already on layer 1, that's fine. Then I'll create layer 2, and I'm going to do my drawing on layer 2. To make things easier to see, I'm going to click on this guy here, and I think I'm going to change the opacity, make it a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to lock layer 1. Now I can't mess it up. I'm going to click back on layer 2, and now I can get on with my drawing. I can use any of the tools that we just talked about, but since I have all curves here, I'm going to use the Curvature tool. I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to grab the Curvature tool, I'm going to change my stroke to black, which I could also do down here. I'm double clicking this guy, clicking this, I'll move this out of the way, and then I'll just start drawing. Now it's still going to fill that stroke because that's what the settings that I had last selected were. That's fine. I can just click on it. I can change the fill to nothing. That stroke might be a little bit heavier than what I want, so maybe I'll drop it down a little bit. That looks good to me. I can move this guy around a little bit, just recenter it, and then I'll just go through the process of tracing this stuff. And I think that's super easy. If I want to tweak some stuff, just like we saw in the earlier part of the tutorial, I can adjust these anchor points as I see fit. If I want to fill these somehow, I can select a fill. Or if I want to do something like add a pattern, I can go to Window, I can open my Appearance tab, and for fill, I can drop this guy down, click on the swatch library, and there's going to be all sorts of stuff that I can add in here. Now in my case, I like the diagonal lines, which I happen to know is in Patterns, Basics, Lines, and it's one of these. That one looks pretty good to me. If I want to rotate it, I can click on this shape, I can go to Object, Transform, Rotate, and I don't want to transform the object, I just want to transform the pattern. So I'm going to unclick this, and there we go. That transformed the pattern without transforming the object. Say OK. Alright, that's one shape down. Now, I can just keep on cruising. You'll notice that Illustrator simply applied the last used fill, but I don't want that in this case. I want this thing to look like this thing. Now I can go up to my Appearance panel and change it that way, or I can simply use the eyedropper tool with this thing selected and click on the thing that I want to copy. Likewise, if I go back through, and I want to do the same with this shape selected, eyedropper tool, this guy, and I can just go through this whole document and simply trace over my hand sketch. Alright, so fast forwarding about 5 minutes, there's a couple of points that I want to bring up. The first is that when you're using the curvature tool and you're tracing a line like this where it doesn't close, if I want to go trace this line underneath it, it's going to want to continue this curve automatically. I don't want that, so all I need to do is hit the escape key to cancel that curve, and then I can just keep on cruising. Another tricky spot is when you've got an exterior curve that also is part of an interior curve. So with this shape, I've got this border that goes around the whole shape, but I've also got these little areas that kind of poke into it, right? Where the bits overlap. I've also got one here, and I've also got one down here. Now, I'm not really sure what the best way to manage this is, but the way that I usually do it is to simply add another layer, select that layer, and then just draw on that layer. What I can then do, if I want to, is on this path, I can then add an anchor point at this intersection there and there. And then again, with that path selected, I can select that anchor point and I can cut it at that anchor point. Same deal here, cut it there. Now I can select this path and delete it if I want to. Or if this was a filled shape, I could simply just draw it on top of the other one and it would hide it. These guys over here are going to be even easier to manage. I'll just do the same thing on a new layer, come over here. And I don't want to actually touch this line, or else it's going to grab it. But I do want it to end there, so the easiest way to deal with that, I think, is just to lock this. And then I can still grab onto it, but it's not going to modify it. Hit escape to cancel the line. I can just go back onto my other layer. Okay, now that's my tracing done. Maybe I want to turn off my sketch and see how that looks. I'm happy with that as a diagram. One last thing though that I might want to do is, because my particular diagram is about funky organic fractal shapes arranged within the boundaries of a cube, which gives it a sort of rectilinear definition despite the fact that nothing in here is straight, what I might want to do is to go back and to add that border. I'll do that with my square tool. Maybe I'll do it on another layer. And of course I don't want that fill, so I'll say no fill please. And maybe I'll use my arrow keys to kind of nudge it around a little bit. Let's turn off that sketch, see how it looks. I like that, but I think it might be a little bit heavy-handed, so I'll click on this. Let's reopen that stroke window. And to make it appear more of a suggestion than a literal box, maybe I'll just change it to a dashed line. That looks pretty good to me. Now I can export it as a JPEG or a PDF. If I export it as a JPEG, it turns it into a raster file, so my ability to zoom in will be limited. Since I went to the trouble to make this in Illustrator, I'll save it as a PDF, which is a vector file. I can zoom into that forever. I'll go to File, Save As, PDF. And this will be my ginger diagram. Now if I do want to export it as an image, I do that a little bit differently, and I go to File, Export As, and I can say JPEG or any of these other file formats. So this dialog box down here, Use Artboard, that's asking me if I want to include this white stuff that I was drawing on, or if I just wanted to export the boundaries of the stuff that I actually drew. So if I don't click this, the image will be cut flush to the outermost object, which in this case is the box I just drew. If I do click it, I'm going to end up with this white space beyond it. In my case, I don't want it. It'll give me the option of exporting a transparent background, because remember, there's nothing behind this stuff. Or a white background. I'm fine with a white background. If I want to make sure that my PDF also has a white background, then what I can do is make a new layer, drag it to the bottom of the stack, which is going to be behind all this other stuff. Maybe I'll copy this shape, paste this shape, drag it into the same spot, put it on this bottom layer, And then I'll change the background to white. Now, you can't really see it, so just to illustrate what I'm doing, if I change the background to blue, see what I'm doing is I'm simply putting a white mat under all this stuff, so that no matter what I open it as, the white background will always be preserved, if I want it. And there you go. There's my vectorized diagram.